George Bernard Shaw once said, "Lack of money is the root of all evil." But another proverb says, "Love of money is the root of all evil." So which one is it?
Yeah, all right, guys. Well, welcome to Geopolitics and Money. Very, very excited to be with you. And we are even more excited because of our guest, none other than Professor Yan Liang. You guys familiar with her? You saw her on my other channel. So she's now here on the bigger channel, and we will be addressing some really, really key issues. So, well, welcome, Professor Yang. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you for having me back. I
Oh.
enjoy your show.
Of course, of course. For those who do not know,
Yes,
we will introduce.
for those who do not know, Professor Yan Liang is a Peter C. and Bonnie S. Kremer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. She is also a research associate at the Levy Economics Institute and a research scholar of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. She specializes in MMT, economic development, international economics, and the political economy of China. Very interesting.
Very indeed, because we're going to be delving a lot into all this. Well, Professor, I'm going to start right away because we don't want to waste a lot of time and we like to learn a lot from you. I would like to have your overall assessment of the current global economy. How do you see it?
Well, I think the question would be very different had you asked me, prior to January the 20th, right? I think, before that day, I would say the economy, according to a lot of the projections and looking at the trend, is that it's going to achieve some kind of tippet growth with a lot of divergences among different countries and different regions. We see, the rise of the global south. A lot of the economic growth is driven by the emerging markets. Right. But I think, after January 20th, right, with Trump's presidency, what we see, I think it's a lot more precarious environment going forward because we know that every day is breaking news. Trump has, really waged that state of the tariff on many countries, including, the most close allies, right? Like Canada and Mexico. One day it's 25% tariff. Next day is a pause. And then it's a 25% on the, steel and aluminum. So I think just there are so many moving pieces and we can delve into the specific impacts, right? But I think, with climate change, with these tariffs that is basically regressive taxes, I think there's a great, risk, right, for inflating the economies, the global economies, reduce the supply chain efficiency, slow down growth, and create a lot more tensions among countries, as well as elevate, business uncertainty. And I think that is a sort of a secondary and yet really significant impact of these kinds of policy uncertainties is that business don't know what to do in the near future, right? They don't know how to invest, where to invest, what to invest. So I think that just create a lot more uncertainty and precarity of the global economy, and that is definitely a downside, right? That we need to do so much more to recover from the pandemic and combat climate change. And so that I think is really an unfavorable change that we are seeing.
Very, very interesting.
So I'd like to dive into what your opinion on the US economy is, because, MMT actually is it okay if we speak a little bit about MMT first? Because that is one of your specialties, and the United States, for better or worse, is following some of those policies. So I'd love to get your take on where the United States economy is, where its weaknesses are, and where its strengths are. There's a lot of conversation about the US dollar, right? The US dollar is strong, the US dollar is weak. The US dollar is reserve currency, but it's far less than it was in the past. Our debt is out of control, but is that really a problem? Is money printing really a problem? So kind of the strengths and weaknesses of the US economy and the ways that you see it.
Yeah, I think there are many facets of the MMT, but I think the most relevant, the takeaways from here is that, money is a public monopoly, right? That the US government will never run out of the dollars. And so that means, yes, right? Because the US is the one that issues the dollar, and this is a government liability, which in MMT community, we say you can never run out of dollar the same way you can never run out baseball scores, right? Its denominator is a unit account. It records how much so-called debt the U.S. government is owing to the rest of the U.S. or the global community if you have dollars, right? So the U.S. government can never run out of dollars. So with that tremendous financing capacity and power, right? So it begs the question, what kind of fiscal spending, right? What kind of public financing that need to be put on the table to serve the public interests? So what we are seeing is, a lot of times we're crying out for the $34 trillion of US debt. I think that really missed the point. The point is, what do we use the debt for? Right? Is it serving the public purposes? Are we investing into the future when it comes to renewable energies, when it comes to cutting edge technologies, when it comes to creating good paying and decent jobs for the people? I think those are the things that we need to spend the US dollars on, rather than financing wars all over the world, right? Rather than providing a lot of the, I would say, capital to the billionaires, right? So I think that is really what the MMT is about, which is that don't lie about the incapacity for the United States government to finance green transition, to provide free healthcare, education, and all these wonderful things to average Americans, right? And say that is a lie, that's a myth. At the same time,
absolutely, that is some, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's a soapbox that I have, right? So I read a comment once when I was much younger on something that said the reason that Americans are against something like universal health care is because they think a broken arm really cost $50,000. In the rest of the world, to mend a broken arm doesn't cost $50,000. It's just what we're told it costs, and that's what insurance pays, right? And so if you're looking at that, of course, it doesn't make sense for something like universal healthcare. But what you're saying is the US, even if that was the case, the US still could pay for it.
Yes, I mean, money is not an issue in this case, right? If the U.S. government provides, a universal health care, all it needs to make sure in this case, which is not a small task, is to ensure that we have the real resources, meaning we have the doctors, we have the pharmaceutical equipment, we have the drugs that are able to ensure the health of the people. It's not about the matter of financing. It's really, do we have enough resources, right, to be able to provide, all of this? The United States, as we all know, the healthcare accounts for about 18% of GDP. The U.S. is spending over $15,000 per capita a year on healthcare, way more than the OECD average, way more than countries like Japan, more than $5,000 only, way more than Canada, and yet achieve less good results when you look at life expectancy, right? So I think that is the point. The point is not about where we'll find the money. The money is always there, right? We can always appropriate the money. We can always create the money. The question is, do we have the doctors, the nurses, the medical equipment, the drugs, and so on and so forth, to really help the people? And I think, this is really, in a way, connect to what we're seeing today, right? The Dodge, right, led by Elon Musk, really slashed, right, all these important public funding for the NIH, right, the National Health Institute of Health, which has been providing billions of dollars every year, right? Right now they have a budget about $40 billion to support those basic research that is really important for healthcare. And they reduced the budget, I think, by 85%, right? And so I think that is really going backwards, right? I'm not against, right, to improve government efficiency, right? Trying to fight wasteful spending and trying to streamline and improve the spending. I think Pentagon, right, definitely should be able to pass one audit.
That sounds good.
Right, but the point is, all these very essential, I think, investments, I would say, in the U.S. economy, right, in the people's daily lives. NIH, NSF, National Science Foundation, again, they slashed the budget by 2/3, and so on and so forth. Right. So all these spending, I think it's actually really worthwhile, right, to provide the basic research for healthcare, for science, for technology. But I think that is really going against, the average American's interest in this case by, in the name of, right, fighting efficiency and cutting government budgets.
Well, so it's really, Sorry,
No,
David.
go ahead.
Because this is very, very interesting to me. It's so fundamentally, I think something that we definitely agree on is the fact that there is enough money to take care of everything we actually need taken care of, right?
Mhm.
If we actually wanted something like universal healthcare, or if we, if the funds were going to the places that they needed to, I saw this statistic the other day, and it blew my mind that I think it's San Francisco. Don't quote me on this because it's not exact numbers, but this is about what's happening. Is that San Francisco, for every homeless person they have, they're spending like $100,000 a year on homeless charities, right? So like, if that actually was something that people were interested in, if quite frankly, I guess the government of San Francisco or the federal government were interested in really taking care of the homeless population, really taking care of them, there is the money to do that. It's just, and that really highlights in a sense that there is no political will to get that done. Because if there's the money to do it and it's not getting done, what does that mean the problem actually is?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that is really important that we really, talking about democracy, right? I think democratization of the resources allocation, right? It's really, I think, what counts, what matters, right? When you don't have economic sort of a democracy, that you are using the resources to only enrich the billionaires instead of really taking care of the average Americans. I think that is a problem, right? That we have the money issuer, which is the US government, and that we have the money users, right? Everybody like you and me. We need to be part of that monetary system design, right? We need to have a say to say what money we want to create and how money is going to be spent. And so I think that is really the key message of the MMT.
Very, very interesting. To those who just joining us, we are having a conversation here with the Professor Yan Liang. And I want to shift the conversation to the trade tensions between the U.S. and China. So as we all know, I think what's coming, what lies ahead, is even worse, in my opinion. And please correct me if I'm wrong. With the trade tension between the U.S. and China on the rise, what can we expect as American consumers, economically speaking?
Well, I think the point here is that, Trump is not just waging a trade war with China, right? It is waging a trade war with many countries in the world. And so I think right now, China is subject to an additional 10% of tariff, right, on top of the 25% that, Trump term 1 has imposed on China and Biden inherited. So we're talking about an extra 10% of the tariff. And this is on a wide range of products, affecting about $450 billion of Chinese imports into this country, which is different than, Trump 1.0, where a lot of consumer goods were actually exempt. But this time around, when it comes to, consumer electronics, so your iPad, iPhone, laptops, all of these are subject to that extra 10% of the tariffs. Not to mention the EVs, right? That China only sells 40% of its automobile exports to the United States. So all these cool BYD cars, I'm sorry, American consumers, you're not getting them anytime soon or ever. But yes, so the point is, this tariff is going to be affecting a lot more consumer goods directly. Of course, indirectly through industrial production that relies on a lot of these Chinese intermediate goods. Then you're also likely to see, the products rise in price. And even for the industries that are not directly affected by the Chinese imports, if they're competing in some ways, now without this competitor, right, the U.S. producers can again have more room to increase prices. So I would say, the impacts are quite, far-reaching. And you can break it down to the different sectors and, different income groups. And I think, primarily the lower income, right, middle income or low income families would be, hit the most, because they rely a lot more on these very completely priced products from China.
But it might be, if I may follow up on this while I'm thinking about it, is this going to harm more the American consumers or the Chinese consumers, or both? And if we are to say the Chinese will be harmed, which I don't see that, given that China just posted a surplus of about $992 million, almost $1 billion, $9.5 billion, almost
Yeah.
$1 billion. Yeah, they just had a surplus for how can we square this away?
Yeah. So what I would say is, tariff does not create winner, right? Tariff
I agree.
produces
Yeah.
just situation. So for the U.S. consumers, yes, they bear the direct brunt of tariff because tariff is a regressive tax and it's not paid by the foreigners as President Trump would like us to believe.
Absolutely.
Right. It is paid primarily by the importers who then will pass that extra cost on to consumers. So according to the Peterson Institute of International Economics, the PIE, with Trump's tariff scheme, right, not just taxing China, as he pledged to 60%, but also 10% across the board for all U.S. imports. This is going to cost American households on average $2,600 per year extra. $2,600, right? Let that sink in. So yes, consumers in the United States will bear the direct brunt of tariffs. Now, China, right, does not like tariff either, right? Because it does help to provide some external demand, especially when you look at 2024, net export contributed to about 30% of China's GDP growth, right? So 5% growth multiplied by the 30%, net export contribute to about 1.5% growth of the Chinese GDP. Now, I would argue that last year was quite unusual, right? Because there was a lot of front loading of, the foreign importers of the Chinese products in anticipation of the trade war. So I think, net export really contributed disproportionately to Chinese economic growth past year. But if you look at the bigger trend, the Chinese domestic demand is the primary driver of the Chinese economic growth. To put it alternatively, given a large economy like China, right, with $17 trillion of GDP, with over 400 million middle class, the demand will come primarily from within. Okay. But I think, it does take some time, right, for the domestic consumption to really recover from the COVID hit. And so in this, sort of this gap, right, that exports is quite, useful, right, to supplement with the domestic demand. So in that sense, China does not like to trade war. It wants to build this stable, constructive relationship with the United States or any countries for that matter, right? To believe in open trade, right, that would help to facilitate economic development, also to build the trust and build the cooperation to fight some of the common global challenges. So in that sense, I think, China will try to avoid a trade war, and China has been playing pretty cool-headed, I think, strategies at this point, right? The retaliation is very targeted, very limited, very restrained. China is open to negotiation and all the sort of the goodwill cooperation on things what Trump is asking. But that said, I don't think China is afraid, so to speak, right, to push back on some of the unreasonable requests or demand from the United States, even though it might, in the short term, hurt the economy a little bit. But I do think that there's a lot of powerful toolkit that China can, use, right, to cope with the kind of external shock.
So it's very interesting because I think we've talked a whole lot about the fact that tariffs, the way that they're being touted here in the US is that, the tariff is going to hurt Mexico, or it's going to hurt Canada, or it's going to hurt China. When in reality, those countries aren't going to be really who ends up paying the tariff, right? Tariff is a tax on the US people, but it's not called that here, right? So interestingly enough, like, I'd like your opinion on why you think Trump is putting these tariffs specifically on China. But in general, why is he even attempting to put these tariffs on? They, with Mexico and Canada, the reasoning that we got was fentanyl. And although I want as much fentanyl off the streets as humanly possible, I don't personally believe that's what's happening here. And many, many people agree with that, that those two things are actually not really related. It's just something that connects all three countries, right? Because there's, the chemicals come from China and Mexico, whatever. So what do you think his actual motivation is for these tariffs, knowing that in reality, even if the question was between a US good and a Chinese good, we don't have that as an option. We don't produce enough here in the United States to make that choice as a consumer. As a consumer, we really only have the imported goods. We don't have both. And in a world where we had both and could make that choice, a tariff might make sense. But in the world where we don't, this tariff doesn't seem to make much sense at all. So what do you think the real reason is that he's actually imposing these tariffs or using I don't want to call it economic warfare, but it kind of is economic warfare.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Let's call it what it is. It is economic warfare. It is economic coercion. I think, at the face value, Trump has four main objectives of using tariff as a tool. He's spoken about using tariff to raise revenues, right, as a so-called external revenue services. It seems that he really believes that the tariffs are going to be able to fund the US's government budget, right? But we all understand, given a large economy like the United States, the imports is only a small proportion. The tariff has no more than about 2% of the total federal budget in the past 70 years. I looked at the number last year, or 2023, it was 1.57% as a source of the federal revenues. You would never be able to tariff enough, right? Because if you tariff, you also reduce your imports. So you can't really, tariff that much to raise enough revenues. So that's number one. Number two, he wants to reduce the US's trade deficit. And of course, he has this very interesting business mentality, right? If I am importing more, I'm running a trade deficit, that means I am losing, right? But the question is, when you buy from a store, you get your goods, you pay for the things that you buy. Are you a loser in this case, right? So that, I think, it's a second point. The third point that he wants to do with tariff is to protect the domestic industries, and in a way, I would want to say force or compel other countries to invest in the United States, and therefore bring back the manufacturing jobs and bring back the production back to the United States. And we can also talk about why, again, that could be very problematic, right? And with the recent 25% tariff on aluminum and steel, you clearly see that he wants to bring steel production and aluminum production back to the United States. But at the same time, there's a reason why the United States is importing aluminum, right? 80% of the US's demand or consumption of aluminum are imported. And the great majority of the imports come from Canada. Why Canada? Well, it's because during the Second World War, the United States realized that they need a lot of aluminum. But aluminum is what people call the disguised or concealed electricity, meaning it takes a lot of electricity to manufacture aluminum, right? So what would be the best way, the cost-effective and the sustainable way of producing aluminum is to produce in Quebec, in Canada, because they have a lot of hydropower. The electricity is cheap. And so that is really a strategic partnership and alliance, right, with Canada, that Canada is going to supply, aluminum not only to the United States, but U.S. allies, right, to be able to finance the war and to be able to, secure enough aluminum supply. So now Trump all of a sudden decide, well, we need to bring back the aluminum, production in the United States, and wage this tariff. While of course countries like Japan or Australia would say, okay, we'll come and invest in your country to build steel, aluminum. I don't know which country is interested in doing that. Given the U.S.'s uncompetitive energy, cost, electricity, I doubt it's going to be making much sense, right, in the productive sense to bring these jobs. And also, let's think about the alternatives, right? Do you have enough infrastructure? Do you have enough energy? Do you have enough workforce to produce these products? And if you do think this is very essential for the U.S.'s national security, right? I don't know why Canada would be considered as a threat to the U.S. national security. But I think if you really want to bring back in manufacturing jobs and productive manufacturing or jobs, you need to really think about the whole package of industrial policies, not just coerce the investments and you think that would take care of everything. Okay, my last point here is, he's using tariff as a tool to get non-economic objectives, right? Be it forcing Panama's to exit from the BRI, or force Mexico and Canada to help with fentanyl crises and the border crises, what have you, right? He thinks it is a tool to gain those non-economic objectives. Now, at the end of the day, I think really what is behind his motive, right? Not only because he's ignorant on what exactly the tariff is and what it can achieve, what he can achieve through tariff, but also it's a deflective strategy, right? Telling the American voters, the MAGA supporters, that you know what, you don't have to go paying jobs. It's not my fault. It's the Chinese's fault, right? If there's a fentanyl on the streets, it's not my fault. It's the Mexicans' fault. So I think it's deflection. It's a deflection of the policy incompetence, right? The lack of, sensible policies and the willingness, the political capital, the political will to address these very difficult problems facing average Americans. So that is a tactic.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think the issues facing America is they're actually very substantial. They're substantial, they're complex, and they've taken decades for us to get here. And most people didn't realize we had a problem until the problems were so bad that you couldn't ignore them anymore. And that's where they're at right now.
Well, that's why this idea of bringing jobs back, I don't buy this, Professor Yang. I mean, whatever politicians are saying, I worked in Washington. I understand how the narrative is spun. You hear this presidential candidates, or even when they take office, we're going to be bringing jobs back. There will be no jobs back here at home because the world has moved on. And if I'm to give just an example, and I'd like to have your take on this in the technological aspects. Yeah, I'm sure you heard of what happened with DeepSeek recently, a fraction of the cost, but also that one exposes how far we fall behind when it comes down to competing with China technologically. I mean, we saw it through the Congress that passed the CHIP Act.
Oh,
Chips and
and
Jobs Act.
and here it is. China moved ahead
and
and started to build its own chip. So, and this leads me to ask you this question. Do you see, in your opinion, with these trade tensions that exist, will this pave the way for exposing the gap between where China is technologically and where the United States is?
Well, I think, I guess I have twofold sort of answer to that. I think for one, we can't ignore that the US is still a leader, right, in that technological development area. I think we cannot under discount the US's, sort of leadership, right, and its sort of prominence in technological development, right? After all, you still have companies like NVIDIA, you have OpenAI, you have Google, Meta, and the list goes on. So the US is still very advanced in that technological leadership. The problem, I think, with the United States is, what are they going to do with the technologies, right? We now have these $1 trillion worth of companies, okay? But we're not seeing really the benefits to the average Americans, right? This is what some of the people call a techno-feudalism, right? That these companies, they are capitalized, they are taking advantage of the technological developments for their exclusive assets and rights to extract, technological rent. So I think that is really the problem. It's not that the U.S. technological advancement is going to be, I would say, completely curtailed, right? But rather really the direction where using technology for common good versus using it, as a rent-seeking tool, only enrich, again, just a small group of technological elites and political elites and, economic elites. I think that is really, really problematic. Okay, so that's why I think the Chinese approach, right, making the AI technology a lot more accessible, right? It's an open source technology, make it also a lot more affordable, A fraction of cost, as you just mentioned, right, as ChatGPT, it would really help for this technology to be shared. So one example is, as you hear recently, the BYD, right, the largest EV maker, are going to integrate DeepSeek in their cars to enhance their auto driving functionality. And this is not only in the high-end cars. We're talking about cars that cost only like 70,000 yuan, which is about $10,000. So it's the average Chinese are going to benefit from this kinds of technological advancements that you can see. Their homes become smarter, their transportation means become smarter, their work become more efficient, and their life standards, right, the living standards gets a boost from this, right? And they're not paying $60 a month to be able to use these AI chatbots. So I think that is the main difference between the two. Now, that said, I also think that now the United States is having a lot of counterproductive policies, I would say. The example that I mentioned earlier, right, that slashing the funding for NSF or NIH, it essentially does is it take away those foundations of technological innovations, and it also drive away, and this is super, super important, drives away a lot of foreign talents, professionals, right, who used to come to the United States and do their research here. Now you take away the funding, it puts a lot of uncertainty on these people's career. They will return to their home country, right? And so I think that would really create a very large disruption in the United States, technological foundation. And I think that is very concerning. So one example, again, I wanted to just see the sort of expose the policy contradiction. On the one hand, Trump is, convincing the Saudis and sorry, not the Saudis, the SoftBank, right, the Japanese bank, to invest $500 billion to have the Stargate program, and they're talking about we can use NI to detect the cancer cells, and that's going to advance the medical field. On the other hand, you are slashing the NIH funding that provides basic research for cancer cure, right? So you can clearly see $500 billion investment, which again is going to enrich some of these investors and other, big tech giants. Then you're really taking away the basic foundation of the medical research. I just don't think this policy was square and is going to cripple the U.S.'s technological sort of prospect.
Well, and as you're talking about those numbers, I mean, I think one of the realities is that everything in the United States is so economically bloated. So, we had the example of DeepSeek versus, OpenAI, right?
$500 billion.
Right. So it was, it was like 2 billion versus, $5 million or whatever it was. And so I think that that's one of the biggest issues that faces the United States in terms of competitiveness and in terms of technological advancement in every single area. When it costs so much to get just about anything done. And like you said, right now we are massively watching money go to the hands of a very, very small elite population, whereas the rest of everybody is more or less struggling. Like, regardless of where you are, if you're not an elite, you're pretty much in like the rest of us category where everyone is struggling. And so countries where innovation isn't as expensive to do, I wonder if that actually really hurts the United States in terms of innovation in every sector. Because it's so bloated. Everything is so bloated. And that is one of the things that I think is interesting that Doge is doing, is looking at the bloat. Not that I agree or disagree with, some of the stuff that they're doing, but looking at fundamentally this bloat means that the United States isn't competitive.
Right. Well, I mean, there's the flip side of the costs, right? The flip side of the cost is profits, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Right. So when we are charged a lot more on everything, somebody is paying from this. And I like the way you put it, right? Bloated. Yes, I think this money game is just getting bloated. The US's GDP is about 20% of the global. The US trade now is more or less maybe 15%. But when you look at the stock valuation, right? The stock cap is 50%. The stock index is over 70%. you have really just this bordering kind of the financial markets, and yet the average Americans are not really benefiting from this, right? 1% of the American population hold 90% of the stock value. So the benefits don't really trickle down, so to speak, right, to the American Americans. So I think that is the problem, right? That's what many economists point out. This is the financialization, coupled with this tech feudalism, is I think the current trend of the U.S. economy, right? That you have this very bloated financial sector that is very much it deviates, right, from the real productive economy. So when you send the best talents to the Wall Streets instead of building to be a tool engineer, right? That is a problem when you invest so much and trade so much in the financial sector, instead of really looking at the productive sector in terms of technology, in terms of productive capacity. Then you are basically causing this sort of a hollowing out effect, right? That you have this really large technological sector that only enriched the magnificent seven, and you have this financial sector that again only enrich the richest 13 financial institutions, just leaves the rest behind. And I think the US's approach to this is double down, right? You hear JD Vance is giving lectures at the AI summit at Paris summit, that he's basically saying, look, half of the global investment in AI is going to be in the United States. So continue with this money game, right? And deregulation is what we will, proceed forward. And he's accusing, other countries for regulating their AI. And what you were seeing here is basically saying, the rich, the technocrats, actually not technocrats, I want them, the feudal, the techno lords, right, are giving all the freedom, whatever they want to do, right? Even if they endanger the public interests, so be it, right? As long as they can make money. And so, to me, this is very this is very concerning. It's sort of like, I don't know, giving fire to a young child and just let them do whatever they want. I think it's what we are seeing right now.
Well, so then what do you, because I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, watching this to me seems unsustainable. Do you think this is unsustainable? And what do you think is going to happen to the US economy in the next 10, 20, 30 years? Because this seems very lopsided in a very bad direction.
Yes. Well, I think unless you can really have meaningful changes, and we're going to talk about, what are maybe the agents of changes. There are only two ways this can go, right? On the one hand, you're going to see the US have major financial crises, because what goes up eventually comes down, and MMT.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, part of the MMT is these Minsky's insights of financial instability hypotheses, right? That basically saying that financial instability is endogenous. It is created within the system itself. So you can't continue to pump up your financial bubbles without the real economy supporting it. So that, I think, would be very concerning, right? That you could have a major eruption of financial crises and stagnation and recession and even depression of the US economy. And then on the other hand, I think, with the 4 years Trump is in office, I think it's very, it's very likely to see a lot of disruptions. And some of these disruptions might be non-violent, but I wouldn't discount the possibility, right, to have very violent changes, which is again, but very, very concerning, very disturbing. So I think, we do need to have meaningful changes, and I think the changes need to be bringing in, these financialization process, bringing in the military industry complex. Right. A lot of people said Trump is pro-peace. I think, there's a big question mark about that. Yeah, he might see the hot war as destructive monetarily, right, or economically. But let's not forget, he openly said he's not going to promise not to use military coercion to take Greenland, for example, or I think Panama Canal for that matter. Yeah. So I don't want to say there's no possibility of doing that. So I just think that, he's probably going to exhaust other means. But that, again, it's something that is very, very catastrophic, right? Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, that will be just to add to this one here, Professor Yang, that the world should be ready for some, how shall I put it, posturing that's going to be coming out into South China Sea soon. And I've already got a word yesterday that the new Secretary of Defense, who's not even qualified for the position, is already in, you know where he is? He's in Poland. He's already pushing. So just to mention this off the, so we're going to be seeing some. But I want to shift to one particular other important aspect of this, the global economy writ large. And this has to do with BRICS. Given how the expansion of BRICS with over GDP, global GDP, that is almost, 35% now? And it's almost dwarfing now the G7, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
How do you see the BRICS progress moving forward, given Trump's adamant policy regarding punishing countries who's going to be transacting in other currency beside the dollar? And we all know that BRICS, one of the aims in BRICS is to sort of stay away from the dollar and use their own currency. And they have the right, if I may say, they have a right to use whatever currency they want. How do you see that the evolvements of BRICS moving forward?
Yeah, so that is a great question. I think, again, the necessity, right, is a matter of invention. I think everything points to the fact that, the US is weaponizing the global financial system. It's weaponizing the global trading system, weaponizing the global economic system. Right? Over 60% of the low-income countries are under the United States, one form or the other, economic sanctions. So I think it clearly shows there's a need for the global South countries to, build a sort of alternative system, right, in a way to counterbalance the U.S. dominant system. So I think the BRICS clearly understands this, right? Last year at the Kazan summit, I think Russia very clearly mapped out some of the plans to build alternative financing system. So it's a BRICS Pay, which is basically a payment BRICS payment system. It could take place with the local currencies, with the BRICS Pay to facilitate local currency clearing. It could build some kinds of a common sort of a clearing unit, right? Not currency, but some kind of unit. And they also talked about beefing up the new development banks. They talk about building more insurance schemes, and also the reserve contingency agreements. So they are working towards that. Also, this grain exchange, right? Some kind of commodity exchange that bypass dollars. So I think there are some very tangible measures that they are taking. And they're also, talking about improving, right, the intra-BRICS trade. And of course, we also know that they have been expanding, right, with Indonesia now joining, and then a couple other very significant trade. The partner countries. They're not the full members yet, but they are the partners. So I think we're likely to see, right, the expansion of BRICS, but also the improvements, right, on their specific measures to improve the intra-regional trade and also payment system. And I think also varieties of economic cooperation. Now, I think definitely there are some challenges. I know that countries like India is not particularly favorable of sort of this common payment system. But I think if anything, Trump's behavior should be a wake-up call for its most closest allies, right? I think if Canada can be subject to tariff, I mean, why Modi would think India would be exempt from that, right? I mean, India. I think India does have a trade, sort of a deficit with the United States. So in some ways, it's kind of safe at this point. But you would never know, right? There are other things that I think could trigger, right, some kinds of actions on the part of Donald Trump. Now, I think, again, Trump's threat, right, of 100% tariff on these BRICS countries, again, will only backfire, right? Because what you're saying is that I am going to completely cut off trade with all these countries. Well, if you cut off trade, if you're not importing, you're not paying dollars to these countries, well, these countries are not going to be able to use the dollars if they don't have any.
Yeah.
When you think about the logic, it's completely flawed, right? The more you want them to use dollar, then the more you want to engage them, right, with the possibility of getting dollar and using the dollar. We're going the completely the opposite direction. So, yeah.
And just on this one, if I may add just this quickly here, will there be a role for the crypto when it comes down to transactions in BRICS? Is there any possibility of that?
Well, I mean, central bank blockchain technology, cryptocurrency that has central bank behind, absolutely. That is what the mBridge project is about, right? To have CBDC, the central bank digital currency, used as a way of transaction, as a way of clearing between different countries. There's a huge room for that. There's a lot of efficiency gain. There's a lot of security, improvements in that payment architecture. But if you're talking about these private cryptocurrencies, no, those are just speculative financial assets.
I was just curious.
I get criticized a lot for saying that, because I know avid supporters for cryptocurrencies.
I know that was the reason why I asked, Professor, because I've been having some conversation with some people, and they mentioned that it's the possibility. But I said, I mean, I am not a financial guy. But I just don't see how the likes of India will allow this to move forward when it already undermining certain policies of BRICS. So to me, it just was, but who knows? Maybe.
Let's dive into another topic that so I have two questions. Two big questions.
And I have one more because we don't want to hold.
I know we don't want to hold you
forever here. She has things to do.
So my two questions are this, and they're not related. So let me ask the first one first. So we talk a lot about the rise and fall of empires, right? So the United States is very clearly in the decline stage of its empire, but China seems to be in the rise state of its. So so we see like a lot of the strengths that China has, but there are a lot of weaknesses also. There are a lot of things that China is facing, and there's a bunch of reasons they're facing these economic issues. So what are the economic issues that China is facing that you can see?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And again, I think many people think that, I'm only, playing the violins for the CCP, right?
No.
I do think that over time, right, I think for better or worse, we are seeing that as far as economic strategy is concerned, I think the Xi Jinping's administration is actually doing everything, in the broad sort of strategic sense. I think they're moving towards the right direction. I truly believe that, right? I think coupled with the kind of strategic planning, going beyond the political cycle, every 4 years you change, the administration, you change the policies in the United States. That is not the case in China. So I think that long-term planning, coupled with the understanding, right, of the power of public money, right? I think the two things that the Chinese government will never let go, despite marketization or globalization or whatnot, they will stay under the control of the government. One is land, the other is finance. So I think, with these two very powerful tools, if they get their policy direction, if they get a strategic direction right, I think they can do wonder. And why I said their strategic direction is correct, one is so-called high quality development that started 2017, that they says we don't want to pursue, double-digit growth rate, right, just for its own sake. We want to have more technological driven growth, and hence, the Made in China initiative. We want to have more inclusive development, and hence you're seeing the increase in the social safety net in the Chinese economy right now. Again, giving a 10-year span, you can see the increase in public spending, in pension, in healthcare, in education, and R&D, right? We can see that happening. And finally, we want to have sustainable growth. And hence you see this green investment, right? Green development, not only in China, but also, China is financing a lot of renewable projects outside of China. So I think, high quality development, as a strategy is, moving the country towards the right direction. And so I think that is laudable, right? Now, we could talk about the motives behind Xi Jinping, right? It could be he's really genuinely caring about this 1.4 billion people. So they really wanted to do something beneficial right, for average Chinese. Or maybe all he cares is about his power. But to gain political legitimacy, he needs to make sure that, people's economic life is being taken care of. Whatever the motive is, right? I don't necessarily care, right? What I care is, are they able to see clearly where the long-term growth path of this 1.4 billion people country is moving towards, and whether they have the tool, right, to be able to move China towards that direction. So I would say, yes, the direction, right, at the strategic level, I think they're doing the right thing. Now, when it comes to challenges, we know there are many short-term challenges. The stock market, the stock markets, yes, even though there was some recent rally because of the attack. But I think the stock market has been quite, quite in sort of this very stable, but, not, sort of a rising kind of thing, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, right? Why do you need the stock market, right, if it doesn't necessarily benefit everyone, in that market? And I think, China's, as far as the enterprise is concerned, right, their financing mostly come from bank lending, bank loans, and that serves them well. So I don't necessarily think the stock market is too important. Only about 10% of Chinese households actually have a direct exposure to the stock market. So I don't think that's a big problem. Now, the housing market is a separate story, right? But I think it is
the thing.
Yeah, I mean, as difficult as it is very important to have what I would like to call a controlled demolition, right? Because the housing market was growing, I think unsustainably, right, since the global financial crisis. So it does need to be reined in. It does need to be stabilized. But then it does create a lot of collateral damages, right? When it comes to household wealth, when it comes to investments, when it comes to, consumption by the households, the slow sort of weak confidence and so on and so forth. But again, I think the Chinese government remains aware of these problems, and they had the policy pivot last September, and they're going to continue to roll out what they call unconventional fiscal and monetary policy to help bolster, domestic demand, strengthening confidence, improving consumption demands, and so on and so forth. And we don't have enough time to talk about, here, I think very specifically in terms of what is the real consumption picture in China. But I would say, the Western story, the narrative about collapsing, right, Chinese economy is completely false, right? It's completely only serving their political and geopolitical interests.
That's true. I was there and I saw with my own eyes. There is none of that nonsense what they're saying, because I would have seen the signs, and I moved around long enough around the places that, you don't go just to where the high-rise building. I went to certain areas where average Chinese people live, and there's no sign that I didn't see any of the collapse the way I understand it. So if I am to compare what I saw in Detroit, then that's a different story. So and it was like, that's to me what the truth is all about. You're gonna have to. That's what I didn't see any sign of that. That was the whole reason why I went.
Well, so I have one more question,
okay,
if you will allow it.
Sure.
And that is, I would like to envision a future where the US and China are working together and are not enemies. I think that is a very important future to put out there and to envision, so that we don't have to see, we don't have to see the economic war. We don't have to see the hot war. I don't think that that's necessary. And I actually think that if the United States really is going to stay competitive on the global stage, then it does actually need to learn cooperation instead of, so it's like the carrot or the stick, right? So the US policy has been the stick for a very long time. And the stick has made, unfortunately, a lot of enemies, which I think are not in the United States' best interest, despite what they want us to think. Most people don't like being punished. Wow, what a shocker there. So I do want to envision a world, and I'd love to ask you what that would look like to you, or what that might take for the US and China actually to become partners and benefit both countries.
I think that's an excellent question. And that is really trillion or gazillion dollar question, right? I mean, when it comes to US-China relationships, I think we can only see three different paths, right? One is mutual destructive path, which we absolutely need to avert.
Yes.
And I think that's very clear, right? China has a nuclear warheads. The US has also the highest amount of nuclear warheads. These two countries cannot be in that mutual destructive path, right? And so I think, David, you talked about earlier, HACSAF, right? That
Yeah.
basically from the NATO's, we're going to pivot towards, Asia, right, militarily.
Yeah.
And there are 100,000 troops, American troops in Europe, 1/3 of them in Germany, and they have 3 times more in Asia. So I think that is very concerning. I'm not a military expert, but I do understand, once you have this much of military presence and you have, regular sailing of U.S. Ships in Taiwan Strait, I think, this kind of accident could happen. And if that happens, right, not to mention some of these provocative, right, kind of testing, right, I would say try to test the limit. I think that's very, very dangerous. And I'm quite worried about that, right? I think just not long ago, the Financial Times talked about, using Taiwan as a bargaining chip on the Chinese and U.S. Trade relationship. I was like, are you kidding me? How many times China needs to say this is their red line, right? If you touch, this issue, there's no negotiation whatsoever, right? This is going to be a mutually destructive, I think, path, and we need to absolutely avoid it. And I think, as insane as Trump is, I think he probably won't really, try to go that route. But again, accidents could happen, and that is, I think, worrying. The second path could be China and US become really close partners, right? They cooperate in all areas possible, technologies, climate change and economy and geopolitics, what have you. Well, that would be great, but I don't think is realistic. As you said, the US has been in hegemon in the world, for more or less 80 years now. I don't think they wanted to easily relinquish, right, the kinds of power and supremacy to a second contender. So I don't see that path very realistic. So that leaves us the third, right, which is what China has been saying. We need to have peaceful coexistence. We manage the differences and we cooperate in areas that we can, right? Before Trump, climate change could be one very fruitful area for cooperation, right? Now with Trump in office, that is gone. Well, the next possibility is on technology. Well, that is again quite unlikely. So I think what could be happening, right, is to have some low stake corporations, right? I think when it comes to people exchange, I could see China would welcome Americans to come for tourism. The U.S. may welcome some Chinese investors and tourists to come to the United States. I think that could happen. China could, invest in the U.S. Maybe not in the EV industries. I don't see that happening, even though Trump said they would like. But when it comes to a lot of these softwares, I think the U.S. will be very concerned about, again, data security, national security, very much, expanded version of that. And I don't see that happen. But I think in some of the lower stake industries, there could be some Chinese investments and so on and so forth. So I think that middle path, it's more likely to happen, but it still takes a lot of wisdom. It takes a lot of policy design. It's a lot of goodwill for the two countries to be able to do that. I think on Sunday, right, during the Super Bowl sideline, Trump said that he already had talk with President Xi on the phone. And there's no very detailed information, disclosed about the conversation. But if they are talking, right, first time after Trump's inauguration, I think that's a good thing, right? Keep the communication channel open and try to find ways to cooperate. I think that would be, the best scenario going forward.
Well, regarding just to close this up, I had some talks with some of my contacts in Asia, and you notice now that there is this trend now that exists in the US that the scientists of a Chinese descent, like for example, Chen Jing, already moved back to the US.
Back to China.
Back to China. Sorry, and we're talking about an award-winning computer scientist here. She's like a blockchain expert. So my point is just you noticing. I was talking. You remember Dr. Dashwan Feng? You did the show.
Yes.
He and I we communicate frequently, and he informed me that he also noticed that there is this brain drain from the US that's sleep, and to me that is where the gap is gonna get wider.
I agree.
So
I agree.
I just hope some cool level-headed will prevail in Washington and realize that this is a win-win for humanity. not just the US or China. It's for everybody. If we are to, I think the problem I see it is that we don't want to deal with China on an equal footing.
Mm-hmm.
That is where I see the problem. We want to always come with that.
The thing is, in a sense, the United States economy has been built on being the top, right?
Yeah, but the world has changed.
I know that, but the US people don't know that. And so I think one of the reasons that Trump won is because people understand that the US is in decline, but they don't know what to do about it. Yeah. And so they're seeing their average cost of existence be exorbitant. You can't get eggs. Everything is expensive. Yeah. All of a sudden you have like no buying power. And so that's a huge shock, because one of the it's not just the United States, governments do this all over the world, where they're like, oh, it's not a problem. It's not a problem. It's not a problem. It's not a problem. Oh, just kidding. Everything's collapsed and it's failed and it's awful. Right. Yeah. And so, people aren't prepared for that here in the United States. And right now, unfortunately, that's what's happening. So I think there really does need to be a kind of global, or like a US slow awakening of, hey, this is actually unfortunately where we're at. So, but we still do have that competition, because that's what the media has been feeding people for decades, for most of people's lives, if not their entire lives.
Well, Professor Fang, I'll give you the last word.
Yes.
What is some advice, some words of wisdom for at least not only our community here on the channel, but for most, not only here in the US, but just from people around the world? I'll give you the last word. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the United States still has a lot of strengths, has a lot of potential, right? Yeah. I think the unfortunate thing is we elected Trump. I don't think we can, escape the fact that, Trump won the election. So that means, I think I hear, Elizabeth, you talk about this very clearly, that the Democrats have failed us, right, when it comes to these living cost factories. And of course, Trump pledged to help. Many people said he had this sort of promise capped kind of, modus operandi. But I think now we should see that it's not happening, right? He's been in office, for a while now. We didn't see the Russian-Ukraine war ended in 24 hours. We didn't see the price come down, right? He's not saying that we're going to reduce inflation. He said price would come down. And that clearly is not happening. And there has been no coherent and consistent policy to bring the cost down. The only thing that he talk about is Joe baby Joe. But I think the Wall Street has also clearly pointed out that Trump also wanted to end the Ukraine war by slashing oil price and cut off the financial support for Putin, which means the oil price has to go down. How would you have oil producers to ramp up production if the prices of the oil go down? It's not possible to do that, right? The oil price needs to be $89 per barrel, according to the Financial Times, for the U.S. to, increase production, massively or meaningfully, right? They're already producing 22 million barrels per day. It's not going to happen. So all these talks about bring down the prices, right? Help with the pocketbook economics for every Americans, it's not happening. So I think that is really a wake-up call. And I think we also need to really kind of look within ourselves, how we get to this point, right? How the industrial hollowing out is happening.
Sure.
Why there's this feudalism phenomenon going on, and what we need to do about it, right? I think collectively we do have the voice. Collectively, as voters, we should keep the cool head, getting the right information, right? Watch Dr. O's show, not Fox or X. I think really, understanding our own strengths and weakness and act accordingly, wisely, I think it's all the most important, right? To really, in a way, to make these politicians work for us is what needs to happen. I think, again, in the United States, we have two-party systems. The administrations change, but the policy are always the same, which is, again, to enrich, only the elites and disregard, the suffering of the Americans. And so I think that for Americans, it's really a wake-up call. And I think for the global community, for China and others, of course, play in a cool-headed way, right? A lot of times narrative is narrative, rhetoric is rhetoric, reality is reality, and play the long game and, strengthen your own economy from within and build partnership with other countries, outside. And I think that, collective and solidarity and, making right policies for your people, I think are always right, how you can move forward, regardless the volatile and uncertain global environment.
Well, we are so grateful to have you, Professor
Yes,
Yang,
thank you.
sharing your knowledge with us and to the community. This is what you get, guys, listening to Professor Yang. That will help you understand the issues on a much bigger scale, per se. So we can't thank you enough for carving out time for us here, and we look forward to seeing you